Hey, everybody. It's good to see you all this morning. Happy holiday. I started off the day right. Went out to my car and realized I left the sunroof and the windows down. It was the second time this week. I might add that. Second time in my life and the second time this week. So I'm drying out. Um, Thanks for that song. That was beautiful. I feel privileged really to be a part of this place and to hear songs like what we just heard and to hear Rod's meditation. It's a gift, and I feel that a bit this morning. So thanks for being a part of this place. And I want to give you kind of a roadmap of where we're going for the next 6 months. I thought it would be interesting, not just me, but several of us, if we returned again to a conversation about our own values, the things to which we sort of gather around like a fire, and look at them again. Values are not static, like the way we think about a law, like the law of driving 70 miles an hour, which you don't keep anyway. Values invite us into a kind of lively and active conversation, and it's important to continue to have it. And so for the next 6 months, we want to have it directly around our values. So we're going to start off with well-being. And in fact, I'll just list them for you now so you have them sort of fresh in your mind, and they're on your white sheet. I'm going to start with well-being, and then I want to jump to the beginning of the order, which is common humanity. So this month will be well-being, the following month will be common humanity, then diversity, then open inquiry, then compassionate action, and then care for the earth. And not just me, but we'll invite our guests to, again, like a bonfire, just gather around the flames of this value and help us relate to it and talk about it and think about it and wrestle with it. That's kind of where we're going over the next 6 months. And it's also a reminder of, who are we? What the heck are we doing here? Why get up on a Sunday morning? I mean, that's annoying. So why? Why get up? Why turn our attention to these kinds of questions and to a question of values in general? And I think values are different than beliefs, because beliefs, I mean, it's hard to know what a belief is anyway, but to say you believe something, like what does it mean to believe in well-being? Oh, I just believe in well-being. So? It's much more a question of, well, what do we mean by well-being, and how am I related to it, and how might I define it, and am I really living into well-being? What about the well-being of other people? And suddenly you're in a much deeper conversation than whether or not you believe in a certain value. And you know that. So we want to get beneath the surface and not just say, hey, let's gather around and say how awesome we are that we believe in these values, but let's let them work on us a bit. Let's let them put a little pressure on who we think we are. So, in other words, I'm saying values are lived. Maybe that's the best way to say it. Values are lived. And are we living the way we say we would like to live? And maybe you live your values whether you like it or not, consciously or unconsciously. You probably violate your values consciously and unconsciously at times. At least I do. Like I said a couple of weeks ago, I am a hypocrite. And that seems to be a great doorway to change, to realize, oh, I've violated my own value system. I've said one thing and I'm living quite differently. And suddenly you're looking at yourself in the mirror a little differently. So a conversation about values, I hope will do a little of the mirroring that I'm talking about. I think another thing that's also maybe important to say at the beginning is, at least in my mind, values express an aim, like a direction, a place to go to, like looking at the horizon, rather than something we've already achieved. I mean, would you say you've achieved the things I just mentioned? Common humanity, diversity, open inquiry, compassionate action, care for the earth, well-being. Then you're dismissed. You know? Go and live your life. No, it's much more like an aim. This is something we're aiming for, and we're likely to fall short of it, which then becomes an invitation. All right, what are the ways I'm not sort of living this way? And I actually think about C3 as a place where we hold ourselves in the light of these shared values. Or again, like the metaphor I just popped into my head a minute ago, like we gather around the fire of them, and we can feel their warmth. And then maybe occasionally we even get burned by an ember. Nice reference to that quote in Job, by the way. As sparks, what was it? As man is born to trouble as sparks fly upward. Yeah. So like those sparks sometimes jump up out of the fire. Now I'm twisting the metaphor and burn us a bit. Be like, I'm not really living up to the thing that I'm holding before me. So anyway, and I think about C3 as a place where we can wrestle with meaning and purpose and history and the present and the spiritual and the secular and science and myth and psyche and our own stories. Like, who are we? How did we end up here? I think that's one of the gifts of a place like this. In other words, standing around the fire, we might feel a bit of embarrassment at the ways in which we're not living up to our own aims, or even shame. I know shame gets a really bad reputation, but shame is like one of those primal, embodied experiences. Tell me you know what I'm talking about. You didn't wake up and say, I sure would like to feel some shame today, okay? That's why it's in the Adam and Eve story. It's just that instinctual. And in part, I mean, there's loads of ways to read, the story of Adam and Eve, but one of them is that something has been violated, either their own values or some kind of value system, and they feel that flash of shame, and they realize they're naked, which is they're highly vulnerable, in other words. By the way, God doesn't shame them in the story. God says, who told you were naked? Which is such an interesting question. He's not like, got you suckers. I knew it. No, it's much more so what I'm saying is that there's some kind of primal indication that something is amiss. Your values have been violated, or you've violated your own. You thought, I'm not living up to what I'd like to live up to. Have I made sense? So, in other words, I'm telling you, I'm going to shame you. I'm kidding. I'll give you an example from the week's news that brought some embarrassment. Maybe embarrassment is a lighter way to say it. I don't know if you were, I know you were following the news. If you heard the Trump administration official that made comment to the poem that's on the Statue of Liberty. This is, the Great Colossus. Emma Lazarus, thank you. I actually gave a talk on this poem last year, if you remember. You probably don't. But anyway, let me give you the line, and then I'll give you the line that was suggested as a replacement. I don't know how literal he was being, but nevertheless, it was a suggestion. So here's the line. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. It's a line from the poem. And, my dad was an immigrant, came from Northern Ireland on a boat and landed at Ellis Island and was a part of this wave of masses. And I like the fact, this makes me believe in poetry. It's amazing to me that there can be a debate, a political debate about a poem. I think there's hope, But that's the line. And then it was suggested, maybe it should be changed to give me your tired, your poor, who can stand on their own 2 feet. Hey, I see you laugh. Who will not become a public charge. Now, I know you all feel self-righteous right now. Who would think that? What I'm suggesting is that this probes around in values. Really, not phrases. Like how easy to say, I believe in the Statue of Liberty poem that says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. I believe in that. So what? How are we either living this or not living this? Is this really a value or not? And also to say something like, who will stand on their own 2 feet, you have to be honest, this too is an American value. It may actually be one of your values. Now, you might not suggest it should be scratched into the Emma's poem on the Statue of Liberty, but have you ever thought to yourself, it's important to take responsibility for your life and to do what you can? Okay. So I'm saying this is a conversation about values, and values are hard to talk about. It's on a continuum. It's not so black and white. It's not one is wrong and one is right. It forces us into the ambiguity of things, which is where I'm going. I'll eventually get to Aristotle here in a minute. But we should feel that flash of embarrassment. I was very embarrassed when I heard this thing. I thought, God, and then I thought, wait a minute. What's being said? What conversation should be? What kind of conversation should we be having right now? Besides phrases, how are we living? How are we creating environments and cultures that express our values, and how do our values need to morph and change and be challenged? So anyway, I thought it was a timely, it seemed almost like an accidental admission, you know, but it definitely infused, I think, the conversation. So what am I saying? The most powerful forces, I think, in our life, in modern Western American life, things like politics and the economic machine, the entertainment industry, and technology. These are the big 4 that seem to govern so much of our life. How can we have the most difficult conversations about the value systems behind these machines? Meaning the moral landscape and the ethical landscape behind this stuff, behind technology and politics and the economy. I mean, like, think about the news that we're heading toward a recession. All right, so, supposedly we're heading toward a recession. What is the moral and ethical landscape behind the numbers? Do you ever listen to Marketplace on NPR? When I do, my kids think this is the most boring thing I have ever heard in my life. But every time they do the numbers, that's what they say, let's do the numbers. They play that little song, we're in the money, we're in the money, and they play it. And first of all, I'm not an economist, so I don't even know what it means. But I listen to it like I'm like, oh, of course, I turn it up. Let's check the numbers. I don't really know what it means. But behind it is a whole ethical and moral landscape. And that's the conversation that needs to be had in our culture, in the polis, in the city. Even a value system that economic growth means good and recession means bad. What do we mean by those things? Now we're into the kind of moral landscape that I'm talking about. So, all right, let's talk a bit about Aristotle, because here's what I'd like to say, that Western culture has a kind of spine to it. And the spine has something to do with the Bible, which is why I'm always bringing it up. I don't think it can be ignored. It's part of what formed us. And the other part of that spine is the Greeks, particularly Aristotle, but the Greeks for sure. After all, our version of democracy that we have is rooted in the Greeks, in what we mean by education, primary education, secondary education. We got that from the Greeks. Body, mind, soul, we got that from the Greeks. And what we call virtues, before they were the virtues and vices of the church, they were the virtues of Aristotle. He started the conversation of, well, continued it in a very public way, I should say. I guess he didn't start it. What does it mean to live together in the polis, in the city? And how can we do so morally, ethically? What constitutes a good life? And one reason we know part of the spine, even of C3, comes from Aristotle, is that one of our values is well-being. The very centerpiece of Aristotelian thought is well-being, or sometimes translated happiness. That the goal of life is to pursue the life of well-being, of happiness. I'll tell you more of how to define that, at least according to him, in a couple minutes. But in other words, we're in the deep stream. So I think we have some responsibility to look at the past, as well as be aware of the present, as we think about what kind of future we'd like to inhabit, which is why I'm always bringing up old stuff, like myths and stories, and now, Aristotelian virtues. There are 12 of them. It was so fun. I wish you would have been there. Come to the pre-talk because we said, let's try to list all 12. And we got 5 of the 12, and then we got a bunch of other ones, and then we sort of filled it out. But once you saw them up there, you think, okay, all right. These seem like values and virtues worth pursuing. So we want to talk a bit about that. And I already mentioned a couple weeks ago, part of living in this civil society involves a conversation about virtues and values. Otherwise, according to Aristotle, you're an idiot. Remember I said the definition of an idiot is someone who's not involved in the polis, in the life of the city. That my personal well-being is tied up with your personal well-being. Therefore, we have to conduct ourselves as members of the polis. Otherwise, we end up in that kind of narcissistic, nihilistic cul-de-sac that I'm always talking about. That's from Ken Wilber. Round and round we go, narcissism and nihilism. And that we want to get out of. So I'm going to give you all 12. You ready for them? Okay. Courage is number 1. I'm going to try to weave these in sort of slowly over the next 6 months. Just say, every once in a while, say, where do we come from? What do we have to learn from the past as we talk about how we might live our present values forward? So 1 is courage. The next is temperance. Temperance. Remember that old thing? Here's another one. It's hard to define some of these things, and I don't know Greek to be very accurate here, but generosity or charity might be the best translation here. So, being generous. Remember that? So we've got courage, temperance, generosity. Here's one I love, magnificence. Magnificence or radiance is another word for it. God, wouldn't you like some of that? Real magnificence? Huh. Here's one that gets sidelined for obvious reasons you'll see in a moment, but one of his virtues was pride. Not a vice, but pride. What he probably meant by that was something like self-satisfaction. I am who I am. Here are my gifts and my weaknesses. And I am showing up today. That's pride. We need some of that. We might call it, in contemporary pop psychology, self-esteem. Self-esteem. Here's another one, honor or respect. When you get on the bus, the public busing in Israel, you sit down. If you sit down in the front seat, right in front of you, in Hebrew, it says the verse, respect your elders. They're telling you, don't sit down if you're young. Let someone else take the seat. It's amazing. So honor or reverence, respect, something like that. Here's another one, good temper. Being of good temper. What does that mean, being of good temper? I can think of a lot of examples of that not being the case, particularly in the political sphere or even in the entertainment industry. It's kind of just public people might come to your mind. Friendliness. Friendliness. It's an art form. What does that mean to be friendly? And again, I think Dick was pointing out that a lot of the conversation, whenever you start talking about this, there's a continuum here. You can be too friendly, or you can be not friendly enough. But you have to be having the conversation if you want to have a good life, says Aristotle. So friendliness, truthfulness. I know that we don't have any need for that in our culture. telling the truth or just being honest, forthright, telling the truth, pursuing the truth. Here's another one. I've got three more. They're not mine. Wit. Wit or humor. Or if you want to combine the last two, think of Oscar Wilde. If you're going to tell people the truth, make them laugh. So it's just, he had those two virtues going for him. Here's another one that's related, friendship. Friendship as a virtue, as a value, something worth pursuing. And the final one is justice. Justice. I know sometimes we look back at old cultures and say, well, they weren't as equitable as ours today. Women didn't have the same rights. And a lot of that is true. But Aristotle was saying we have to be in the conversation of justice. We recognize that our own systems cause inequalities and injustices. And either we're going to look at them or not. And to look at them is to begin a conversation of living a virtuous life. Have I made sense? So now we're done. You just go and be virtuous and end of story. So a couple more things I want to share from Aristotle here. He says there are three kinds of people in the world. There's the person who pursues pleasure, and he means physical pleasure, as their primary motive. And then he has like pages and pages of how this can go terribly wrong and leads to the opposite of a virtuous life, he would say. So you have pleasure. You have another kind of person that pursues recognition at all costs. In other words, fame. I want to be recognized wherever I go. And he has pages and pages how this ends up in a non-virtuous, idiotic life, in the Greek sense of the word. And he says the third kind of person is the kind of person he's encouraging people to become, and that is the person who pursues satisfaction of the mind, is the phrase that he used. In other words, a life of education, of ongoing change. Body, mind, and soul, submitting yourself to ongoing education of your own way of being in the world. Ethics and values and morals and knowledge and inquiry. And that is the only thing he says can lead to the good life, to a life of well-being. Now, I'm sure you can think of other kinds of people, three kinds of people in the world, but just sometimes I like simple things like that. Do you want to be a person that just pursues pleasure, your own personal pleasure? Do you want to be a person that just pursues recognition? Or do you want to pursue the kind of path that can lead to some satisfaction of the mind? And we can extend the mind if you don't like that, if you get hung up on that, but just a life of pursuing something. Okay. His word for well-being is eudaimonia. I actually brought this up like 6 months ago. Eudaimonia, it's one word. Eu means well, and daimon in Greek means something like spirit or being, or even divine spirit, something like that. Your own inner essence might be what it means. But combining these two, well-being is what Aristotle meant by happiness. Pursuing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was not invented by the founding fathers. In fact, I think it was Benjamin Franklin wanted it to read life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Was it Jefferson? Jefferson wanted life, liberty, the pursuit of property, and Franklin wanted life, liberty, and the pursuit of well-being. And they're quoting Aristotle. Remember the days when those who wanted to be in politics needed to be philosophers? It was a long time ago, it seems like. Oh, man. Anyway. Yeah, so this pursuit of well-being, I'm going to give you a list of things that Aristotle thought would lead one to a life of well-being. First of all, that eudaimonia was active and not passive. And that's different than how contemporary people think about happiness, because we think about it sort of being like, well, it just sort of comes upon you by luck. Like if you win a lottery ticket, great. Then it sort of falls into your lap. He says, no, that's not the kind of happiness that I mean. He means pursuit, going after. It's active, not passive. In other words, you can do something about it. And that's what made him kind of controversial. You can do something about your own well-being. Now, you can't do, it's not the case that you can totally control it, because he says there's also something that we call chance. And sometimes things happen to you by chance. And he said the greatest of people recognize that things happen to you by chance and choose to pursue well-being anyway. In that kind of active response to the world. So that comes from Aristotle. In fact, I'm reading this book by Edith Hall. You can check it out. She's got a book on Aristotle. It's probably in the bulletin here. I put the reference. Anyway, she says, you've heard of the unexamined life is not worth living. That's Socrates, right? She says, well, Aristotle would be more like the unplanned life is likely to be unhappy. That's that active component. Making a plan, an aim, going for it. And to not do that, you're likely to live quite an unhappy existence, according to Aristotle. So here's another component of well-being. He says, the path is one of self-conscious habit. So you have habits, many of them are unconscious, and now we know, thanks to depth psychology, just how unconscious we really are. But nevertheless, self-conscious habit is part of the path of happiness. It's not a one-time thing. It's not buying a lottery ticket. It's saying, what does it look like for me to cultivate over time things like courage, temperance, justice, generosity, magnificence, pride, honor, good temper, friendliness, truthfulness, and friendship. Thank you. You guys are listening. Here's another line from his. Do the right thing. Do the right thing. I know we live in a postmodern world. What does that really mean? So forth. But you get the sense of it, correct? And he says, do the right thing even though the gods are not involved. He was quite a radical thinker. One of the first people to say, the gods up there are not involved in human affairs. Do the right thing anyway. That's pretty radical. That's 2,330 years ago. Aristotle's wrestling with some of these things. He's also sometimes called a moral particularist, which I know that sounds fancy, but it's not. It means even in our values and virtues, some flexibility is required. I'll give you an example. Tell the truth, right? Always tell the truth, right? Except when you're hiding Jewish people from the Nazis, then lie, correct? That's that moral particularism. That comes from Aristotle. He's giving people the freedom to say, life is not so simple. You got to settle down in the details. The devil is in the details. And get busy and shine that light on just how complex life really is. Don't live by cliches and words and phrases and mental belief systems. Get down into the messiness. That's where you'll live a virtuous life, he would say. And he says, ultimately, well-being is about the attainment through understanding of the world. Attainment of an understanding of the world, what we would call education. And this is going to be my final point. So Socrates, probably the founder, and I also throw in the rabbis here too, came up with something that fancy people called peripatetic philosophy, or philosophy by imitation. It literally comes from the word, which I put in your bulletin for you, to walk around. How do you live a life of values, pursuing these virtues, or take our values? How do you do it? You walk around. That's how you do it. You don't think alone. You don't believe the things. You don't put inspirational quotes on the wall with eagles flying. Okay? You walk around. That's the path. And Aristotle himself logged hundreds of miles with his disciples working these things out. Walking around. Seeing what justice would look like if they went to this town or that town. Or when they bumped into a stranger, how they might need friendliness. Or when things were very contentious and the authorities of the town were after them, when they might need wit. Do you know what I'm saying? That education in that sense, the peripatetic way, is to learn by walking. That's why Jesus said, come follow me. He didn't say, I've got a special list, and if you'll commit it to memory, you'll be fine. He says, just let's go for a walk. That's it. Let's go for a walk. Let's learn as we go. Let's let our own ideas be refined in the ordinary, everyday existence of just being a human being. Where I shop, what I buy, how I interact with people, who I talk to, who I avoid. That's the fertile ground for having a real conversation about values. Have I made some sense? Here's another line from Nietzsche. He says, only ideas gained through walking have any worth at all. Okay? Only ideas gained by walking have any worth at all. Same with Aristotle, and Jesus would agree too. So here's my challenge for you. Let's go on a walk the next 6 months. Let's go on a walk. We're going to walk together. I'll be there. You'll be there. We'll walk at our own paces, but we'll walk together, more or less. And what are we walking through? Well, we're going to walk through the landscape of our own values, starting with well-being. That's how we're starting. And we're going to walk around. We're going to ask questions like, is this really a value of mine? Because it's possible it's not. Actually, it's not. Or it's possible it is. Or it's possible it needs to be refined. Or it's possible that we pay lip service to it, but we have a long ways to go and sort of folding more of that into. It could be the case that we're fine, but we're not extending well-being to other kinds of beings, other human beings, and other living beings. So let's go on a walk the next 6 months. And my challenge is to you to go on the walk and to look at these each month and let them, like gathering around a fire, let them burn and shine and challenge and reveal how you're living. Because I think the easiest way to have these conversations is to say, I can point out 10 people on the television that do not have these values, right? That is boring. I am tired of myself doing that. It's easy. It's a little harder to say, wait a minute, how is this light shining on my own sort of way of being in the world? So that's where we're heading. I challenge you to read our own values and keep them close over the next 6 months. How am I walking like this? How am I not walking like this? Who is walking like this, and how can I come alongside? That was always the old way anyway. Aristotle, Jesus, I guess Nietzsche too. Just let's go for a walk. Let's see how this stuff works out. Who's walking like this, and how can I walk a little like them? That's where we're going. Thanks for listening.